Next, we're going to look at some examples of classification. And I want to start off with an example from a healthcare situation. We have a doctor who collected data about his patients and is interested in using blood test results to predict which of his patients have chronic kidney disease. This doctor was studied chronic kidney disease over a period of years and collected data from many of his patients. And we can take a look at the data set from this doctor. And what we see here is a table of results from all of his historical patients. You can see there are 150 some rows in this table representing the 150 some patients he's seen over his career. And for each patient, he recorded the results of all sorts of different kinds of blood tests. You can see here each column represents a different blood test, and as well as some other diagnostic information about them. So there's their age, there's their blood pressure, and then there's a bunch of different blood test results, like the sugar level in their blood, or the red blood cell count, or so on and so forth. And there's a whole bunch of these different lab tests that he had ordered on all of these patients. And finally, in the last column, we can see here the class. And the class is a word that indicates which type of patient this is. A class of 1 indicates a patient with chronic kidney disease, and a class of 0 indicates a patient who did not have chronic kidney disease. Okay, so this doctor was interested in this because he wanted to use historical data to do a better job of diagnosing patients in the future, so that his future patients, he could predict which one of them had chronic kidney disease. So this is a perfect setup for a classifier. We have a yes or no question. Does this patient have chronic kidney disease? Based on the attributes of that patient, the results of their blood tests, and the doctor wanted to develop a classifier to help make predictions to answer that question based on the attributes of this patient and based on the data he has about historical patients. So we can take a little closer look at the data set, and you might be wondering of the different patients he had, what the breakdown was, and what we can see is that there were, out of the 150 odd patients, there were 43 of them who had chronic kidney disease and another 115 who did not have chronic kidney disease. So it's not an equal split. So whenever you have a new data set, you should start by visualizing, exploring the data set to get a feeling for it. So I started by making some scatter plots to visualize for me how these different attributes relate to whether the patient has chronic kidney disease or not. And I decided to make some scatter plots. I picked a pair of blood test results and showed on the scatter plot each of the patients. Each patient is represented here by a single dot. The blue patients represent healthy patients. The yellow dots represent patients with chronic kidney disease. And the location of the dot on this plot indicates the results of their 2 blood tests, their glucose level and their white blood cell count. All right. So one of the things the doctor was interested in was finding out not only how to predict which patients have chronic kidney disease, but which attributes are most helpful at answering that question. Because there's no point in giving a patient 20 different blood tests if 2 of them are enough to do a very good job of diagnosing the patient. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture. And I want you to imagine that the doctor has a new patient who walks into his office, and that new patient corresponds to a dot that is up here near the top of the picture. Okay, so maybe I'll draw this for you so you can think about it. There's a new patient up here. how would you diagnose that new patient? Do you think, would you diagnose them, you be the doctor, would you diagnose them as having chronic kidney disease or not? Well, hopefully you said chronic kidney disease. And why? Because you can see that the patients with chronic kidney disease tend to have a high glucose reading. High glucose number tends to indicate chronic kidney disease. So the higher up you are in this chart, the more likely you are to have chronic kidney disease. And also higher white blood cell count tends to be associated with chronic kidney disease. So the more to the right you are. And this red dot is quite near another yellow dot here, which was a historical patient who we know did have chronic kidney disease, because for the historical patients, we know their diagnosis. So this new patient, the best bet is probably predict that they do have chronic kidney disease. No guarantees, but that's your best bet. Let's try another example. Suppose you have a patient who walks in the door and their blood test results place them down here, down in this lower left corner. How would you diagnose them? Well, I'm guessing you're saying most likely healthy, do not have chronic kidney disease. There are no guarantees, but that seems like the best bet given the data, because there are lots of patients in this lower left end who did not have chronic kidney disease. And this new patient seems most similar to the historical patients who did not have chronic kidney disease. So our best guess is, from the blood test results, this new patient probably doesn't have chronic kidney disease either. Okay? So if you start to think about how you would program a computer program to make this diagnosis, after looking at this data, I hope you could come up with a computer program that would make a diagnosis. Pause the video for a second and think about what computer program you would write to diagnose the patient given their glucose level and their white blood cell count. Okay, I'm guessing what you came up with is a simple rule that says if the glucose level is sufficiently low and if the white blood cell count is sufficiently low, then diagnose them as healthy, otherwise diagnose them as chronic kidney disease. So you might have an if statement. If the glucose level is less than 120 and the white blood cell count is less than 12,000, diagnose them as healthy, otherwise diagnose them as chronic kidney disease. So in this picture, what that would correspond to is drawing a line here, and everything in the rectangle on the lower left side of your screen would end up with a diagnosis of healthy, and everything not inside that rectangle would end up with a diagnosis of chronic kidney disease. A perfectly reasonable rule to come up with after you looked at this data. One thing I want to emphasize about this rule is that your predictions here won't necessarily be perfect. If we think about applying those predictions to our historical patients, this rule would get the right answer for most of our historical patients, but it'd be wrong for a couple of them. You can see there are a couple of yellow dots down here in the left corner if you look very closely. And what that indicates is there are a few historical patients who had a very low glucose level and a very low white blood cell count. So this rule would have made the wrong prediction. So it's not perfect. It doesn't have 100% accuracy, but it'd be pretty good. It'd be pretty accurate. Okay. So that would be a simple example of a simple classifier. Your classifier has a simple rule that makes a prediction, answers the yes or no question, do we think this patient has chronic kidney disease? So it looks like that white blood cell count and glucose level are pretty good at helping you make a pretty good prediction, a pretty good diagnosis. And so if you had to pick two blood tests to make the patient take, those two would be a pretty good set. So I started by looking at some of the other attributes. I was wondering if there was a better combination that would allow even more accurate diagnosis, and I wanted to show you another one. Okay. So let's take a look. And here I made a scatter plot of a different set of results, this time hemoglobin level and glucose level. And if you take a look at this plot, you can also see a similar pattern where there's a region that seems to be clearly associated with the healthy patients. And so if you were going to write a classification rule, your classification rule would probably say all the patients who fall in this rectangle on the lower right, let's classify those, predict that they're healthy, and everyone who's outside that rectangular area, let's predict that they have chronic kidney disease. So you could also come up with a rule for this one. And if we take a look at that rule, how accurate that rule would be, well, take a second and think about it. Would this rule be more accurate or less accurate? Pause the video and see what you think. I'm hoping you said more accurate. If you take a look at this picture, we see that among the historical patients, it looks like this rule would be essentially perfect. I don't see any yellow dots in this region over here. So I don't see any historical patient that this rule would have diagnosed wrong. That's no guarantee about the future, but it's a pretty good sign that it looks like we've come up with a rule that's extremely accurate. All right, so that's how you would write a rule based on looking at the data and understanding what the data is telling you, and that rule might be pretty good at making a diagnosis. But so far, we're not really doing machine learning because we're coming up with the rule. In machine learning, we let the computer find the rule. So we could think about how would you have the computer come up with a rule like this? You could start to imagine how some algorithms to try to come up with the right rectangle, but what if it's not a rectangle? What if the rule is some more complicated association? It turns out there's a very nice and general way to make these kinds of predictions. And to understand it, go back to the justification we had for how we were diagnosing a patient. If we have a new patient that's over here, we're going to diagnose them as having chronic kidney disease. And why? One way to think of that is because this new patient is very similar to a historical patient that the doctor saw in the past. This new patient has very similar lab results, very similar blood test results. So you might expect that they should be likely to have the same diagnosis. I don't know what the diagnosis of the new patient is. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I do know the diagnosis of the historical patient because the doctor has historical records about whether they turned out to have developed chronic kidney disease in the end. And we know that this new patient is very similar to a historical patient who did have chronic kidney disease. So that suggests that our best prediction for this new patient should be, yes, I think you have chronic kidney disease. So similarity, if we find another point in the historical data set that's similar to this new patient, that makes it easy to make a prediction for the new patient. And similarity in the scatter plot ends up showing up as 2 points are similar if they're very near each other. If they're very near each other on this scatter plot, if the distance between them is small, then that means they have similar blood test results, and so we should probably make the same diagnosis. So this leads to a very simple rule for classification called nearest neighbor classification. When I have a new patient, what I do is I find the most similar historical patient. Out of all of the past patients in the historical data set, find the one that's most similar to this new patient and use that as my prediction for the diagnosis. And the way to figure out which of the historical patients is most similar, well, that just comes down to which of the historical data points is closest to the data point of my new patient. Okay, so that enables us to make predictions. Let me try another example. Suppose I have a new patient whose blood test results put them right over here in the picture. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data point down in the lower right, and I'm going to find the closest of the historical patients. In other words, the closest data point to that. And the closest data point to that is going to be one of these blue points. So that means that the most similar patient in the historical data set is a healthy one. So therefore, for the new patient, the diagnosis we should also make is healthy. So that's called a nearest neighbor classification rule, and it's a very powerful classification rule. And in the next videos, we'll show you some more examples of this.